Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fairfax County Democratic Committee National Affairs Forum, Reaching for the Hand, Not the Throat. How can we understand and deal more effectively with political adversaries? This forum is being recorded. I'm Sandra Klassen, the forum moderator and FCDC National Affairs Committee chair. Our National Affairs forums examine matters of national importance for the purpose of informing, engaging, and inspiring Democrats to action. I want first to recognize and thank those who contributed to organizing and promoting this forum, including my National Affairs Committee colleagues, Abby Block, Ernie Kreider, Stephen Hall, Paul Jameson, Marcus Moda, Ray Marin, Michelle Minapace, Paul Norsey, Andy Scalise, and Lisa Singer, as well as thank our FCDC Executive Director, Jack Corrali, who is managing our meeting technology. And finally, cartoonist Robert Gorell, who generously granted us permission to use his cartoon as our promotional graphic. Our program will be divided into 3 parts. In part 1, the 4 panelists will deliver presentations analyzing the causality of polarized politics in America. This will be followed by Q&A. During their remarks, you attendees are encouraged to write your questions for the respective speakers in the webinar Q&A box, not in the chat. We will only monitor the Q&A box. When the speakers conclude their part 1 presentations, I'll ask a National Affairs member to read your questions to them. In part 2, the speakers will address mitigation and solutions, followed by a second Q&A opportunity. Once again, write your questions for the respective speakers in the webinar Q&A box, not the chat, and a National Affairs member will read them to the speakers. In part 3, after the panelists have concluded their formal presentations and answered participants' questions, they will engage each other in an informal open roundtable discussion as the final segment of our forum. So let's begin. The divide between us and them has been growing in America for years. However, differences in the last 15 years during the administrations of former Presidents Obama and Trump have become especially stark, culminating in the January 6th insurrectionist attack on the US Capitol to overturn the 2020 presidential election result. It is now widely recognized that political differences in America, long conceived of as conflicts of interest resolvable through bargaining and compromise, have come increasingly to resemble the more intense and intractable struggles involving clashing ideologies, cultures, beliefs, and values common to many other nations. This forum is designed to solicit answers to 2 major questions. First, what are the most useful ways to analyze polarized politics in America? What insights will help us to understand why our adversaries think and act as they do? What are the most constructive ways to talk about one's opponents and one's allies? Second, how can we deal humanely and effectively with political adversaries? What sorts of public policies are capable of eliminating or mitigating the underlying causes of extreme polarization? What kinds of contacts between individuals, community organizations, religious bodies, or other groups might help to restore coherence and mutual respect to the American body politic? The United States is at a dangerous tipping point, and the 4 distinguished experts joining us tonight will try to help us understand the causes and find solutions to best navigate this danger. These experts are Dr. Justin A. Frank, who is a former clinical professor of psychiatry at the George Washington University Medical Center with more than 40 years of experience in psychoanalysis. He's also a frequent contributor to HuffingtonPost.com, has served as a columnist for Time Incorporated, DailyBeast.com, and Salon.com. He's also the author of Trump on the Couch, Inside the Mind of the President. Dr. Bandy X. Lee is a forensic psychiatrist and violence expert who was a fellow of the National Institute of Mental Health and was a faculty member at Yale School of Medicine. She's a consultant to the World Health Organization, president of the World Mental Health Coalition, and author of Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul. Professor Richard E. Rubenstein is University Professor of Conflict Resolution and Public Affairs at George Mason University, faculty member of the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, former teacher of political science and professor of law, and author of Resolving Structural Conflicts, How Violent Systems Can Be Transformed. Professor Solon Simmons is Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution and Sociologist at George Mason University, and author of Root Narrative Theory and Conflict Resolution, Power, Justice, and Values. Let's begin the discussion focusing how to analyze our polarized conflicts with Dr. Frank. Over to you, Dr. Frank. Please unmute. You're still muted. There you go.
I'm not muted anymore.
Good.
Now, the host has apologized, spotlighted. Okay. Later. I don't know what to do with this. Okay. Now, we're going to talk, I want to talk a little bit about how to analyze polarized politics and where that comes from. It's hard to talk about polarized politics without talking about cults. In fact, deification, which is one of the hallmarks of cults, of the cult leader, is an antidote basically to deprivation. And this happens in groups, it happens in cults. Now, but first I want to talk about the psychology behind polarization, because I think it's important to just be clear about it. First of all, polarizing is normal, at least for a 2-year-old. And in groups, it's normal as well, as we see with the adult Boston Red Sox fans. For them, the good is inside and the bad is everywhere else. And there's nothing in between. And that's the essence of polarization. There's good, bad, nothing in between. I'm good, you're bad. And the Trump supporters say, I'm good, you're bad. When I once liked a Red Sox player at a game, my children would scream at me for being disloyal to the Orioles. They would yell, how can you like an enemy? That's polarization. Now, maybe sports fans are acceptable cults, but I wanted to talk about the psychological process. It starts in infancy, the process of polarization, because the baby needs to organize his experiences into good and bad, since so many stimuli come its way. And this is to maintain some form of real stability, of calm and order in the mind, to protect it against anxiety and inner chaos, fears of chaos. But eventually the baby realizes something special, which is that the mommy that they love, that protects them, is also a bad mommy, that doesn't always change them on time, that sometimes is late for a feeding, that does certain things that bother the baby. So the baby has a new dilemma, which is, how can I like a good mommy and a bad mommy, since I always saw them as different mommies, because that's how the splitting works. You're good or you're bad. And all of a sudden, it's the same mommy that they have good and bad feelings about. That is a very important milestone where children grow to accept, even reluctantly, that they have more than one feeling about the same person that they love. The people who don't grow that way and don't move away from good and bad feelings are people who are stuck in polarized America, because there is no good in Trump and there is no good for Trump people in Biden, period. The other thing is that even if you have matured and you can see complexity, people still need the presence of an other, a not me person, that can help them define themselves by who they're not, by what they're not. And even then there are problems, because the idealized parents, who are now both a good mommy and a bad mommy, a good daddy and a bad daddy, have become human. So children look for something else to idealize, since they can no longer idealize their parents. And usually that's a teacher at school when they're 5 or so. It can be a television star, a cartoon figure. It can be some religious person, God even, to help them feel safe. They search for safety and freedom from anxiety and fears. Now, these searches persist into adulthood, of course, and they lead to marriage, family, patriotism, organized religion, and to joining groups that promise safety and the comfort in order that they have meaning. And that's where cults began, since cults are at the ready for people who feel lost economically and spiritually. And they're ready because there's an inner split between good and bad that people can then start. And that helps us understand that cults, which are polarized, they're based on positive and negatives. They're based on positive belief and hope for the safety. And they also are based on excluding others who are not them. And that's what they want to do. So for instance, white people will exclude people of color. Christian cults might exclude Jews or Muslims. Many Americans might exclude immigrants and be afraid of them who have trouble speaking English. Now, there's one other major influence on American group development, and that's narcissism. And narcissism has been used a lot with Trump. It means self-love, basically. So when a child is hurt or ignored or left out or even abused, he feels a narcissistic injury. He feels hurt and bad, and that injury requires repairing with understanding and love. But that doesn't always happen, so children compensate, if they're not able to be repaired, with a sense of creating an internally unrealistic sense of themselves, what's called a grandiose self. And that feels to them immune from injury. I can do anything. And these were my findings, actually, when I examined Trump's childhood. He created a grandiose self that was above everything. Now, group narcissism also involves grandiosity, and that really helps a group cohere together. They're all sharing feelings of how great they are, and they really are united against other people who challenge them. And this is because, but they're always in trouble because grandiosity is never fully solid. They are afraid of everybody from the FBI to Joe Biden, especially to the voters who elected him. So belonging to the group provides compensation for people who are feeling alone or miserable, and Trump's rallies are reinforced with pride when he mocks detractors, helping his supporters justify their own feelings of indignation and contempt. He uses contempt defensively, so he puts down other people. It's a defensive use of contempt, so he doesn't have to feel contemptible. He puts Clinton down. He wants to put protesters in jail. News media are put down, and they're seen as enemies.
Just you have about 1 more minute.
Oh, well, that's good to know. So I'm going to just say that cults are frightening because of their intensity, and they're frightening to non-members. And not far beneath the surface is paranoia and a distrust of authority, of the government. And even in 1944, when America was united, fighting against Germany and Japan, Roosevelt warned people at the State of the Union that he's going to create treaties even during the war. And he said, please don't get upset by thinking that I'm selling America out with my treaties. So he understood about paranoid anxiety. Basically, polarization is a process that stems from childhood, and it's from the needs to protect children, and polarized groups require leaders. And since Trump lost in 2020, his followers lost their leader, and they feel despair. They feel betrayed by voters who voted for Biden. So they've attacked the swamp on January 6th. wanting to kill those filthy congressmen and women who reactivated their lifelong hurts and resentments. They attacked people of color, from Blacks to Asians, who reminded them of their sense of being treated unjustly. Last sentence, Trump once used certainty to eliminate doubt, but now his followers are left without a place to turn.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Could you please continue with your analysis, Dr. Lee?
Thank you. I'm grateful for Dr. Frank coming first, as he has given a detailed psychodynamic interpretation. Mine is more public health oriented. I became known to the public for editing The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, in addition to authoring Profile of a Nation. Thank you for mentioning that. Anyhow, I emphasized that despite the title, Donald Trump was not the main focus of the book. Rather, his ascendancy to the presidency was both a barometer of the current state of public mental health, as well as an accelerant and exacerbator of the conditions that afflicted it. My co-author, Dr. Thomas Singer, has said, Trump mirrors, even amplifies our collective attention deficit disorder, our sociopathy, and our narcissism. This is not as much a diagnosis as an illustration of the pathology that can arise within a society, just as much as there can be within an individual. And a societal disorder is not merely the sum of individual disorders. Hence, when trying to figure out why political differences in America are no longer resolvable through bargaining and compromise, and why they have become such intense and intractable struggles at the level of clashing ideologies, cultures, and beliefs and values, we must consider the concepts of health and pathology. Just as Dr. Frank has illustrated. Indeed, an inability to compromise is one of the primary signs. Since mental health, or more specifically mental capacity, is a requirement for all rational systems to function. This is why when there's any sign of mental incapacity in a defendant or any other decision maker in court, they are required to undergo a capacity evaluation, as well as to attempt to restore their capacity if they're lacking it. A mental health interpretation does not apply to every political situation. And on the contrary, mental health usually has nothing to do with politics. However, when a mental health perspective is applicable and relevant, we should not shy away from it either. British epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett eloquently describe what they understand to be the overarching problem of our era, and I will quote them. It is a remarkable paradox that at the pinnacle of human material and technical achievement, we find ourselves anxiety-ridden, prone to depression, worried about how others see us, unsure of our friendships, driven to consume, and with little or no community life. Lacking the relaxed social contact and emotional satisfaction we all need, we seek comfort in overeating, obsessive shopping and spending, or become prey to excessive alcohol, psychoactive medicines, and illegal drugs. How is it that we have created so much mental and emotional suffering, despite the levels of wealth and comfort unprecedented in human history? Often what we feel is missing is little more than time enjoying company of friends, yet even that can seem beyond us. We talk as if our lives were a constant battle for psychological survival, struggling against stress and emotional exhaustion, but the truth is that the luxury and extravagance of our lives is so great that it threatens the planet. What these scholars are describing is not just a subjective impression. The actual numbers and statistics are just as devastating, if not more so. The United States, for instance, is the country in which the effects in question appear most pronounced, and it has the lowest life expectancy among all rich countries. Not only is that the case, but since 2014, the average life expectancy in the country has been going down instead of up, unlike any other rich developed country. Moreover, most of the deaths that are contributing to this lowering of the average life expectancy are occurring among people in the prime of their lives between ages 25 and 64. The common causes of death in these cases include opioid addiction, obesity, alcohol, liver disease, and suicide. These statistics do not fit with the prevailing ethos of our country. Americans have always been told that material success brings happiness, but the actual results of that mantra look more like social failure in the midst of plenty. Instead, it seems that what matters most for societal mental well-being is not overall economic success, but rather the way in which economies are developed and how they are distributed. Societal forces like income inequality and unstable employment have psychological consequences, and these consequences create ideal conditions for diseases and deaths. As such, what Wilkinson and Piquet imply is that the psychological breakdown of whole societies is what is at stake here, and it is the result of choices that we make collectively about how to organize our social, political, and economic systems. That vital connection, however, seldom materializes within broader political discussions. Indeed, as Wilkinson and Piquet lament, as soon as anything psychological is mentioned, discussion tends to focus almost exclusively on individual remedies and treatments. Political thinking seems to run.
1 minute, Dr. Lee.
Okay, so in essence, our neglect of the psychological effects that these social and political conditions create are the hidden causes of our psychological division, fragmentation, and political lack of compromise. Pathology is not something that localizes always in the individual. Instead, it may exist in the spirit of the nation, which is common to us all. What this means is that the development and maintenance of national self-awareness must also involve observing ourselves and how we organize our society. So inequality in society, particularly the juxtaposition of extreme wealth against extreme poverty, is of extreme consequence, producing societal wounds that are in a vicious circle with wounded politics. We have an odd system where the holders of a job, the only holders of a job who are not required to undergo a mental capacity evaluation or to even have the capacity to do the job, are elected officials. And pathological individuals are free to seek office. In addition, mental health professionals are the only experts who are gagged from speaking about their area of expertise when political figures show mental impairment, even after they have been elected. Since a public in a poor state of health preferentially chooses mentally wounded figures over healthy ones as a result of their condition, this gives pathology a distinct advantage. In addition, pathological attraction is compulsive, whereas informed rational choice is more nuanced. Some have called pathological arrangements in politics pathocracy, while my co-author, Dr. Robert J. Lifton, calls it malignant normality. It is the condition that has made atrocities such as under Nazi Germany possible.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, very much. Professor Rubenstein, will you please proceed?
Thank you. I'm happy to and honored to. I've just heard two discussants that I find myself agreeing with almost entirely. So this is going to be a kind of happy panel, I think. I want to say that when we teach our students about conflict and conflict resolution at the Carter School at George Mason, one of the things we teach them is that in order to understand a conflict and to figure out what might be done about resolving it, we need to try to put together the kind of the inside and the outside, you know, the psychological factors involved in a conflict, people's motivations, people's emotions, and the way the social system is operating. And Dr. Lee just did that. And I want to do it, I'd like to do it some more because especially if we consider the impact of the pandemic on this society. One of the things that I think we see is that the pandemic has not necessarily created any brand new conflicts, but it has seriously exacerbated existing conflicts. It's shown up, in fact, the weaknesses, the dysfunctions of a system that was not working well before the pandemic is working now worse afterwards. Dr. Lee mentioned a couple of those features already, including an amazing growth of inequality over the past 30, 40 years. She mentions the declining, the growing death rate, declining life expectancy. But also we see from the pandemic that inequalities that we knew existed already based on race, based on gender discrimination, have gotten worse. And that the people who bore the brunt of the plague most painfully were people of color and people who are poorer, people who are not owners of businesses. We also saw that at the same time that these forms of oppression were becoming more intense, that people who had formerly felt themselves privileged and felt themselves in some ways immune from this kind of oppression, recognized more and more that their social status was slipping. And so we got the development of enormous resentment on the part of white people as well as people of color, middle-class people as well as poorer people, although most of the white people who experience resentment are also not doing at all well economically. And what further complicates this and produces the kind of pathology that both Dr. Frank and Dr. Lee are talking about is that rather than recognizing that we have a system that's really not working very well, we have a system that really cares a lot more about equipping troops abroad than taking care of people who need care at home, that we have schools that don't teach, and all the rest, that recognizing these problems, giving them a name and trying to diagnose them and come to some kind of prognosis for them involves dealing with issues that are, and names even, that are taboo. We're not allowed to recognize that the America that we want to make great again is also an empire which is really, in some ways, has been the scourge of the world. We're not permitted to recognize that the system that we pride ourselves on creating mass prosperity was actually creating mass inequality, and that more and more people were living in the condition that the Europeans have come to describe as precarity, not necessarily being the poorest of the poor, not being necessarily living in deep poverty as many of our people are, but being one step away from poverty, one bad sickness, one layoff away from poverty. And that this pervasive sense of economic insecurity, combined with a sense of social insecurity, produced by the fact that the country, among other things, is becoming non-white in more and more obvious ways. So that the kinds of, shall we say, substitute privilege that had helped people live with the fact that materially and in terms of their family lives, even, they were not doing well at all, are being taken from them. At the same time, we see the pandemic producing something very interesting, a reevaluation of authority. My generation, and maybe some of yours, we used to wear question authority buttons, right? We prided ourselves on questioning authority. Now, almost everywhere you look, what people are people all over the place are demanding is authority that actually acts effectively to protect people and secure people, including vulnerable people, marginalized people, but everybody, from the kinds of medical and environmental disasters which we are now exposed to, but which we can predict are going to continue. The COVID is only the most recent in what is undoubtedly going to be a series of environmental disasters caused by the alteration of our relationships with nature. And because of that, people are looking to authority to protect them, but at the same time, they are not trusting authority. There is the people who think that the election of 2020 was stolen are not trusting.
You have 1 minute, Dr. Rubenstein.
Right. They're not trusting anyone. So we'll get to this later, I think, in the second part of our discussion. But in order to give people the kind of authority that they're looking for, we need to also give them a kind of participation, the possibility of a kind of participation, which means that authority is not their enemy because they own it, because they can control it. And we are quite far from being able to either perfect ourselves in terms of delivering effective government and effective authority, or delivering satisfactory participation. So we have our work cut out for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Simmons, would you please offer your remarks now?
Okay, so I'm going to continue on. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
I'm going to continue on with what Rich described as the inside-outside game, which is the both building up from the psychological and also out or coming in from the institutional. I'm a sociologist, but one who's very much interested in what we might call the extra rational. And so what I want to begin with is this thing we've been talking about, economic inequality, just as the structural context for us a bit. This is a piece from the other day from the Washington Post about the big corporations not paying any taxes. Here's a piece today from the New York Times about what happened to the 0.01% in terms of their income and compared to the GDP for the country. You can see that what this shift in economics also means a shift in power. And so the way in which I'm going to be thinking about the theoretical perspective I'm going to offer you briefly here is going to talk about the way in which power is abused. And the psychological effect I'm going to be interested in is the compensation that we seek for to overcome that abuse of power. So it won't be a developmental model, but it'd be about how adults deal with the abuse of power and how narrative plays a role in that. And I wrote a book on this years ago in 2013. In fact, last time I appeared with this group called The Eclipse of Equality, that goes into the causes in detail if you're interested in my thoughts on this. And it builds on a book from what I worked on in grad school that was not very well heralded, it wasn't well known, and called Why the White Working Class Still Matters, which became very different after Donald Trump won the election. But of course, what we were doing is predicting in the 90s that things like this would happen. So this is by Rui Teixeira, you may know who he is, and Joel Rogers, and this is the University of Wisconsin. So it's going to be an argument about the institutional transformation of the social contract and how this transformation has changed our politics. Okay, that's going to be the kind of story, and that's introduced polarization. So the key to understanding this point of view is the word narrative. And of course, many of us talk about narrative these days. The critical insight here is one that I draw from a historian, Hayden White. And it goes as follows. The political message and the political legislation can be separated. Okay, there's nothing about the legislation that inherently has to be narrated in a particular way. We can tell whatever story we want about the legislation, about real events. And that disconnect between what we call in plot, and you can tell the story any way you like. Now, some stories are hard to sustain, others are easier, but that breakdown is what makes it possible. We don't tell stories about economic inequality in an effective way anymore. We're not very effective in the national level, and that makes it difficult to push back and towards equilibrium that we desperately need, even if we want to keep capitalism going. Okay, this doesn't require a radical critique of capitalism. So the simple story is this. There's what I call a story structure, and it's all based on the abuse of power, okay? So you begin an equilibrium, there's an abuse of power, and you fall down into the pit. You, the victim of that power, who's been affected by the villain, reflects on that abuse of power, and then seeks a hero, solidarity, so that they can overcome the power. So you can see there's a deep psychological dimension to this. This is in fact the comedic structure that Dante develops, okay, going back in literary history. And there's nice references here in the history of literary analysis and Vladimir Propp's morphology from the 20s, as well in contemporary anthropology by Victor Turner's ritual process. Can't go into that here, but these are the theoretical frameworks that I'm drawing upon. And what happens is you've got these stories that are available, and then you got what I'm going to call root narratives. Okay, so the whole perspective I'm going to propose is it's in this recent book I published in 2020 called Root Narrative Theory. Okay, so I'm going to give you the basics of root narrative theory and why it matters for polarization in a few minutes. So what root narrative theory does is it says you need to pay attention to power and how people think it's been abused. Okay, so power is real and it can be abused. Here's one form of power. We have a picture of 9/11. The dangerous enemies are coming after the state. Okay, the villain is the dangerous enemy, and the hero who will save us is the state. And this is a very ancient story, going back at least to the pharaohs and before. The Chinese have their versions too, as does everyone. And you want to be protected from them. They're coming to kill you. You ought to protect yourself. That is a reasonable moral argument there. Well, once you develop the state can get powerful. And then here we have Henry VIII. The state can become a bad king. Okay, the bad king is something you have to protect yourself against too. Who's going to do that? The law. You have rule of law to protect you from the bad king. So the solution becomes a problem. And you need to solve the problem that's now engendered by that solution. So you have pushback and you have political compromise. You have arguments that are very fundamentally ideological. This is the birth of the American Revolution. Well, these are stories that are very powerful, but they don't end. Because once you've created the law and the individuals abuse it, well, guess what? They're elites. Some people are successful, others aren't. And they become selfish elites. And when they break that breakdown, they take too much, as we start to see. You have people's movements that push back, okay? This is the basis of socialism. Again, that comedic structure. You're abused, you fall into the pit, you need a hero to get you out. The hero is the people's movement. But even still, once you have a people's movement, you got in-groups and out-groups. You've got white people, you've got black people, you've got men, you've got women, you've got straight people, you've got gay people, and so on. And the ignorant masses, the ignorance itself now becomes prejudice, becomes hate, becomes the villain. And you need to be protected from that. And how do you do it? With status movements. So here we have, if you know Max Weber, there's a famous sociologist, you have class, status, and party here. And party's been divided into a military and a governmental dimension. Okay, so what you have is forms of power that are in the world, they're real, they're not made up. There are abuses. People develop movements psychologically attached to those movements, and they need a hero. Okay, so that's the basics of root narrative theory. And I'm just going to give you a couple more examples of it in practice.
You have 1 minute.
And I'll finish it up quick. So here's just the same thing, but the victims, you got civilians, autonomous individuals, virtuous people, and undaunted outgroups, but they organize around their values. So this is a theory of values. Security, liberty, equality, and dignity are values that emerge from these same stories. That would be the theory. But here's what matters for us, because we get polarized into different groups. Here I've got 4 different figures who represent these various narratives in our politics. We have Donald Trump, we have Charles Koch, we have Bernie Sanders, and the Georgia Democrat who's leading the voting. What's her name is?
Stacey Abrams.
Yeah, Stacey Abrams. You have Stacey Abrams. These are all focused on different aspects of the problem, and they're all leading these movements. The challenge is that you've got these 2 movements that are against one another on the left. You've got the dignitarian movement, and you've got an egalitarian movement that are polarizing and need to work together. And they're working against these other movements which are in the ascendancy. So the basic argument would be this: if you want to understand the other, understand that they too feel pain. They too are standing up against what they think is real power that they're trying to protect themselves from. And this is the nature of polarization. If you can understand their pain, you can start to engage them more effectively. And among Democrats, you're going to have a conversation among the class warriors and those who are fighting for human dignity. And both of those things are equally valuable. And I think the dignity is in the lead right now. And we're going to have to move through that if we're going to be able to get to address that problem of economic inequality.
Thank you, Professor Simmons.
That's it.
I think it's now time to take some questions from our forum attendees. I hope folks have been sending in some questions. Michelle is our National Affairs member who is going to have questions for the speakers. Michelle, do you have any questions for us?
I do. I have some that our committee submitted, so I would encourage our attendees to submit them as well. And I'll start with Solon Simmons. The theory in your recent book seems to presuppose a willingness on the part of the opposing sides to bridge their differences, the existence of goodwill, if you will. But what if the goodwill's lacking? What if the beliefs of one side or the other are so entrenched as to constitute a veritable theology? How do you persuade a true believer to convert?
Well, very interesting. I think that we're true believers too. That's the first insight. We also have our sense of trauma. We also are organized in perhaps irrational ways against our dangerous villains. And I think that in this partisan environment, you might have to unify the different branches of the Democratic Party. Let's call the two different stories: the economic equality story and the human dignity story, both of which are critical, so that you can push back. If you have a bad actor, you might need to have some victories over that bad actor in the short run to change the landscape enough that you can start to implement change. And I think that with the Republican Party, certain aspects of the Republican Party are probably unwilling to accept, they just simply won't believe yet. But if they start to see positive change, I mean, President Biden has an opportunity here. If he can demonstrate to people that he can produce, he can deal with COVID, he can deal with, to some extent, with infrastructure and economic inequality, then people might start to become interested, and then they're convertible. But you don't want to go for the most polarized people right away. You have to have change slowly over time, which is how the Reagan Revolution happened too. That's how we moved toward that right-wing perspective.
Dr. Lee, how did we get here? Why were we unable to stop Trump's rise to power?
Yes, I, as a mental health professional, have been concerned about the state of our collective mental health for quite some time. In fact, for a couple decades. And especially when I discovered that the political conversations were not happening in a way that were conciliatory or even rational, when it shifted from trying to make rigorous arguments and talk about policy to methods that would curtail any argument and just win the battle. That's usually a cardinal sign of a disorder starting to set in, rather than it being an ideological difference. In other words, where different perspectives can come together and work toward a life-affirming goal. The reason for pointing out pathology or disorder in politics or in society, the reason why that's important is because then at that point, all the arguments break down. We cannot appeal to facts or logic. And so, so I've been concerned about this for quite some time and have been alerting about it in my lectures, in my textbook on violence. But unfortunately, the conditions continued to worsen. And once we had a mentally impaired president, I've been mainly focusing on removing his influence that would exacerbate the conditions of mental health in our society. So I still advocate for reducing his influence, for removing him from public possibility of holding public office, and prosecuting him in order to curtail some of the most immediate problems in our society.
Is it possible to join in, or do I have to wait to be asked a question?
Please go ahead.
Okay. I agree with Dr. Lee. In fact, this is a really interesting discussion, but I do think the question about how come people didn't notice it and how come Trump's rise was so powerful, I think is because some of what his criticisms were accurate, that people did feel ignored. People did feel, I don't know about the swamp part, but they did feel that they weren't listened to. They did feel resentment of immigrants coming in and people of color butting in line is how they may have felt. And there's a lot of feelings about being not understood or not paid attention to. And that is called narcissistic injury. And I think a lot of people have had narcissistic injury, maybe 74 million. And the injuries involve feeling ignored, abandoned, and there's no way to repair. The parents don't repair. Trump, for all of his pathology, which is severe, is able to tap into that kind of injury because he was narcissistically injured as a child. He was not very well loved. He was very attacked by his father. And he became very angry and developed a grandiose self. And he is able to tap into other people's narcissistic injury and give them a sense of hope. And that's why so many of the people would gather around his rallies days ahead. They would be waiting to get in. This was not like a fake thing. He didn't just sneak in. He got millions of people supporting him because people have felt injured and left out and have been aware of a decline in life expectancy, of a decline in jobs that have been outsourced overseas, a decline in middle class values. And I think that unconsciously, though, it's like he tapped into this seething rage that has never been really articulated before so clearly. And that came out on January 6th.
Would you liken that to the imprinting that you've talked about?
Well, yes, the way he tapped in was a form of imprinting. I mean, Konrad Lorenz in the 50s wrote about how he had a bunch of ducks or geese, I think. And when they were born, he would waddle around the back garden and these geese would follow him. And then later on, they would still follow him, even after the mother came back into the picture. And he called that imprinting. So that's why people will follow Trump off a cliff. People will still vote for him because even if he shoots someone on Fifth Avenue, as he said, because he has tapped into very primitive needs that are born of deprivation and injury, but not economic deprivation. More than part of it's economic, but part of it is that he has allowed people through the imprinting process to be able to feel free to hate. He has given people permission. One of the things that a president does is that they function in a way as a superego figure, as a conscience for America. Trump actually gave people permission to call the press the enemy of the people, to attack the media, to beat people up, to attack white people, attacking blacks, as we've seen with the BLM movement. And Trump gave permission to bring out latent racism in many people. And I think that's imprinting. It's frightening to me.
I'd like to follow that up.
And I think it'll continue after he's gone.
I'd like to follow that up, Justin, if that's all right. I think it's absolutely right, what Dr. Lee and Dr. Frank have just said. I think this is absolutely right. And the result is that Trump presents himself as a kind of what you might call a fake revolutionary. He's an anti-establishment figure. He does give people permission to act out. I spent a long time in the movement and in Chicago, and he reminds me in a kind of it's a weird way, in a kind of perverse way, of my movement days. He gave people the permission to act out in the way that Justin Frank says exactly, I think, and raises then the question of what's the answer to this? Trump said, among other things, that he was going to end America's endless wars. And he's one of the few presidents in recent history to have not committed us to a new war. Then one sees that the danger for Democrats, the danger for the good guys here is that you reverse all of the Trump polarities. And when you reverse all the Trump polarities, you go from being a fake revolutionary to no revolutionary at all. And you go from being a sort of nationalist pseudo-pacifist to talking about what a threat China is and what a threat Russia is and how we have to be stronger, have a stronger defense establishment and more defense spending than we have even now. And then you're in danger of becoming, in a sense, the anti-Trump.
Yes.
And not of solving the problems that gave us Trump in the first place.
Right.
So I'm just agreeing with my colleagues here. I think solving the problems that gave us Trump in the first place, that's the task in front of us now.
I agree with that.
There are a couple of questions that have been submitted that seem to touch more on looking for the solutions, which will come up in our next segment. So I'm going to hand those over to Abby when the time comes. But I think those are all the questions we have regarding causes. Sandra, if you want to, I don't know if you want to move on to the next segment, and then we'll have more time for how do we resolve this? How do we start fixing what's broken in the next segment?
Was there not a question about authoritarianism in there?
I thought there was. Hang on one second.
And there do seem to be some questions in the Q&A box now.
Yeah, they're touching more on, well, I don't know if we want to touch on these, but
they're more of the solutions than the
that's what it looks like, speaking to how we go about reaching out when people believe so deeply in lies or narrative that it's not supported in facts.
Right.
And that seems to be touching more on solutions and answers to questions and moving forward rather than how we got here.
Well, I wondered, I do have a question for, particularly for Dr. Frank. And
I have that if you want. This may have been the one you were referring to.
Yes, the one on authoritarianism.
Yeah, various papers and studies have asserted that authoritarianism is a dominant characteristic of Trump's followers across all demographic groups. Do you agree? And if so, please explain it, its causes, and its societal and political implications.
Well, I actually thought we sort of had talked about that, which is that people who have been injured and hurt want to be rescued and saved. And they learn how to feel ambivalent, but they still have yearnings for a strong leader, especially if they're weak or poor because of economic situation, or because they have felt abused at home or felt narcissistically ignored and not paid attention to. So there's yearning for a strong leader, which is very similar to the process of the imprinting. But Trump invites that yearning also. He is the kind of person who, I once said to somebody, he's the kind of person who I would think would go into a 2-year-old's room who's having a nightmare and tell him a horrible story and then scare the crap out of him. And then he'd come back a few minutes later and say, I'm going to save you. And he'd turn on the light and everybody would be happy. That's how he functions. He's going to make people miserable and then turn around and make them happy. And maybe that's what I do as a therapist. I don't think so. I hope not. But he really does that. And he does that very deftly and very clearly. And that's the hallmark of an authoritarian. The other things about authoritarians are that they're anti-intellectual. They put down people of science. They put down thought. And that's very clear about Trump. The other thing is, in fact, his father used to mock his brother, who was an MIT professor. But the other thing that they do, that authoritarians do, is they cannot tolerate and will not tolerate any kind of criticism or disagreement. So the buttons that Richard was talking about question authority, those were great buttons because it wasn't like kill authority. It was like, don't just believe it and let's talk. Let's question it. There's this concept in questioning authority, to me, at least when I was in the movement then, of loyal opposition. There's no such thing as loyal opposition. You're disloyal if you oppose. That's what I was saying about polarization. So authoritarians, and then people yearn for somebody to take care of them. I mean, Roosevelt was amazing with his fireside chats. And he made people feel good. Reagan made people feel good, at least white people. And never made me feel that good, but he did make people feel good for the most part. And it has to do with a sense of safety and being contained. One of the other things that happens in terms of authoritarianism is that all people are anxious to some extent. They're anxious about making an income. They're anxious about their lives, all kinds of different things. And I think somebody was talking about the fragmentation. I think Solon was talking about the fragmentation, and we're talking about that. I think that that a president has to contain other people's anxiety and calm them down. That's something that Biden does, something that Obama tried to do, but was not always successful. But Trump makes people anxious.
Thank you.
If I might.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Lee.
If I might add to that, for me, authoritarianism is a political context that is placed on exactly the kind of narcissistic symbiosis, is how I've called the dynamic that Dr. Frank has mentioned, in that there is a leader with narcissistic injuries who fits together with followers of narcissistic injury, like lock and key. And the attraction is almost magnetic, because one of them requires all the adulation and adoration of crowds in order to feel buttressed in their self-esteem, to counteract that intolerable feeling of inadequacy, whereas those who are following require an idealized figure, someone who will project himself as a grandiose person who's a savior, who can solve everything, and who will protect them and take care of them. And that and the leader figure does that in order to garner the adulation. He's not really a leader, he's also a follower and also a wounded individual, but he projects that in extreme that turns out to be very attractive to those who are suffering from a sense of lack of power and ability, and therefore could identify with him in ways that a child would identify with a parental figure.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I think we should move on to part two, unless the two professors want to add to anything on authoritarianism here.
I have a very brief thing to say.
Sure.
I think that authoritarianism fits with any ideology. As you know, we heard Dr. Frank talk about Roosevelt, but also Reagan. And then Trump's a very different kind of person too. And you could have authoritarianism within the civil rights movement as well. I mean, this all can happen. So it's a style more than it is a content. And in particular, if I talk about those different four pieces of the thing, that the circle that I draw, what I like to talk about is a word that I coined securitarianism rather than authoritarianism, because what people ultimately want in that category is they don't want authority for its own sake. That's an instrumental value to get to something deeper, which is a sense of safety from a dangerous enemy. Or from pandemic or whatever. So I think authoritarianism is great, but I don't think that just because you're a national security hawk, you're an authoritarian necessarily. I think we all can be.
But what Roosevelt did was he spoke a lot. Roosevelt spoke a lot about safety and security, and that people can't be secure if they don't make money.
Social security.
Secure. And that's what he did. And he always talked about security and safety, and that their life, if they had that kind of security, they could also have time to play and have fun. He was very much interested in that whole thing. And that, I think, is a form of containing anxiety. It's not an authority figure. I agree with you, although he sounds like it in some ways. I mean, he pushed things through the...
Yeah, and Huey Long at the same time would be the authoritarian version of that.
Right.
Thank you. I think we should move on to part two. Where the panelists are going to address how best to eliminate or mitigate the causes of extreme polarization, and also how to deal humanely and effectively with political adversaries. So we're going to move back and let Dr. Frank again start us off here. What do you suggest in terms of eliminating and mitigating, Dr. Frank?
Well, I suggest, I'm going to change. I wrote a whole long thing about it, but I would rather just talk about it. I really grew up in a psychoanalytic world in Boston, and the professor there used to say that psychotherapy is a big mess taking care of a bigger mess. That's the first thing. The second thing is that that the question is then, for me, because of that, I like to say that talking is the new listening is the new talking. There I go. Listening is the new talking. We have to learn to listen and get to know other people. So you have to know the big mess. And and the way you talked about it in the questionnaire, Sandra, was troublesome to me, because you said, how can we deal humanely and effectively with political adversaries? Well, first of all, you need to recognize that you have to deal humanely with humans. I mean, so the people who are your political adversaries are also humans. And the way it was phrased bothered me a little bit. And I didn't even think of it until just this evening. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, do people who want to talk to Trump supporters even see them as human, even see them as having pain, even see them have lives that they're serious about? And I think that the best way to do that and to bridge the gap is to try to listen in a new way, which is to listen to other people's pain. Now, and to listen to your own pain, because I think somebody said that people have pain on all sides. All four people at groups had pain, and you said that Solon said. So here's the thing. The same man who talked about the big mess and the bigger mess also had a very simple statement. He was a simple kind of guy. And it was that sorrow is the vitamin of growth. And if I were going to write a book about Biden, I've already done Bush and Obama and Trump. I'm not going to do Biden, I'm too tired. But I would just headline it, Sorrow is the Vitamin of Growth, because that's who we've seen in this president. He's faced sorrow deeply, and he's pushed through it. So when he took over as president, the first thing he did was go to the reflecting pool and talk about the 400,000 people who died. There was 400,000 then, and it was an amazing thing about respect and the importance of loss. It was symbolic, but it also led to the internalization of those losses, and that we all have losses. So to go back to how do you bridge the gap, to me, it's talking about pain, that underneath hatred and fear is pain. And what is the pain? The pain is pain of loss, that people have lost. So people are talking about the decline of America, the loss of life expectancy patterns, the loss of the middle class. People who are white are feeling the loss of their majority and the loss of their power. And even though they retreat to white supremacy, they're probably trying to compensate for terrible loss. And what loss is it. Loss is it. So I was gonna read something about Freud, because I know Freud, and he didn't know me, but he wrote Mourning and Melancholia. And he wrote that successful mourning, when we're talking about loss, involves finality, the verdict of reality that the object no longer exists. I think we have to start building anew. And why Biden came in was because he felt that the soul of America was lost because of Trump and what happened. But it was going away when we had welfare queens from Reagan, when we had all kinds of right-wing racist statements from Reagan, who I'm not a big fan of. And that in Trump's case, as with his followers, the loss was not of a person. It was partly a loss of the person, but it was the loss of an idea. It was the loss of a fantasized, omnipotent leader, which was him, but somebody who would rescue us. Now, how do you deal with loss? Well, it's very hard in the pandemic. So I would rather call it...
You have about a minute, Dr. Frank.
Oh gosh, okay, I'll move ahead. I deal with loss the way Cicero said, the connection between mourning and friendship. It's friendship that is the cure for grief. And the question is, how can we listen to other people and their losses who are in a different group? Because there's a loss of America, and the Trump tapped into that. Failed mourning is a problem. And that's why children split the world into good and bad, because they can't mourn. And that's what I was talking about. So I'll just end with Erich Fromm, who said that, and I'll say this myself, I'm not overtly optimistic, but loss is the one link we have between polarized groups. And Erich Fromm said, in matters of life, be it of the individual or of a society, it does not matter whether the chance for cure is 51% or 5%. Life is precarious and unpredictable. And the only way to life to live it is to make every effort to save it as long as there's a possibility of doing so. And I think that's what Biden is trying to do. I think that's what this forum is trying to think about. And I think that facing loss, including my own feelings of loss, I mean, there are lots of them. It's not just from friends who died of COVID. It's lots of losses about fantasies and losses that old people feel, again, getting old. I can't go in the movement because I can't move. These are serious problems.
Thank you, Dr. Frank, very much. Dr. Lee, would you please continue this discussion?
Yes, thank you. In fact, I agree with Dr. Frank, and the group that I'm leading, the World Mental Health Coalition, has just started a Truth and Reconciliation Forum where we intend to interview key individuals, experts, as well as ordinary Americans, and ask the very question, how have you been injured? When people ask me how do they deal with the Trump supporter in their families, friendships, couplehood, I usually tell them don't try to persuade. It's gone a bit beyond that, as Dr. Frank was mentioning. He calls it a cult. I call it shared psychosis, in that there are shared symptoms when there has been mentally severely impaired leader, where the symptoms get transmitted, and it effectively has affected many of those in our midst. I tell people not to try to persuade them, but to fix the conditions that gave rise to their need to cling to such a leader in the first place. And there will indeed be a lot of disillusionment, trauma. But what I had prepared was that wounded psychology is drawn to wounded leaders and attracted to ideas that will make the wounds worse. So, and especially dangerous pathology, the kind that manipulates and beguiles, is often indistinguishable from normalcy to many in the public sphere. It would do us well to require some kind of screening mechanism for keeping pathology out of politics. This would actually go a long way. It's a method of prevention, since once pathology takes hold of power, it is very difficult to get it out. It is the kind of testing that mental health professionals do for multiple jobs. All military officers go through it, law enforcement officers, and many important leadership positions require it. We do not require it of elected officials, who are perhaps the most vulnerable to pathological affliction. Empowering followers through true authority and strength, sometimes beyond their awareness of the need, is also prudent. Simply enabling their unhealthy attractions is neither good for them nor anyone else. With true authority, which is the result of knowledge, skill, or vision, a follower grows in personhood, mutual respect deepens over time, and one gains in independence and power as one absorbs the true authorities, knowledge, skill, or vision, true leader, that is. With false authority arising from a leader's emotional need for followers, one loses personhood, becomes conformist, and adheres on the basis of fear, growing increasingly dependent and disempowered over time. A population may be predisposed to looking for a parental figure to take care of them in times of distress. So it's not only individual parenting that gives rise to developmental arrest or wounds, as we're observing, but also social stress, societal stress can give rise to these characteristics in large segments of the population. And one of the main causes of this is relative poverty, as in the United States, which is more psychologically injurious than absolute poverty. And so the relative poverty, the kind that makes poverty much more humiliating and difficult in the face of there being millionaires and billionaires. So inequality is really what is injurious, or our expectations not being met. For generations, Americans expected our lives to get better, and they're now getting worse. That can also cause injury, as well as racial disparity, where there's a great deal of racism, and we expect the lower races, those lower in the caste system, to do worse than we do, and we watch them do better. That also causes the relative poverty and shame that I've been speaking of. So any kind of inequality actually does do injury to the psychology. The solutions are known and readily available, but the US is unusual among civilized nations in that it does not have a strong, what I call fifth estate of independent experts to serve as a check on the three branches of government to supplement the fourth estate of the press and the news media. Instead, when decision makers do not find their desired answers through existing channels of evidence, science, and scholarship, they seek contractors or partisan think tanks to get the perspective they desire, and they handpick those whom they would like to consult as experts. And that's one of the reasons why we are pursuing the Truth and Reconciliation Forum, where we will, based on peer review, select the experts who would speak on the important issues of the day. And this also, the lack of this kind of expert input truncates a chief means of deliberation, one that is based on sound scholarship with a composure, detachment, and research integrity that are usually the standards of scholarship that are independent from political considerations. So I'll just skip ahead. Addressing the issue of social inequality is a project that should start immediately. Joe Biden is doing a good job with some aspects, but inequality is an enormous problem that virtually affects all other areas of our lives. Psychologically, it not only creates social distrust and inept governance, but produces a large population of vulnerable people unable to protect themselves against public health threats, including both a viral and a mental health pandemic. So as such, the secondary consequences of rampant inequality is that when crises hit, such as the coronavirus pandemic, the gap between those at each end of the spectrum widens alarmingly further. The same thing that we can currently observe to be taking place will also happen when the nation is met with any other growing array of global crises.
About a minute.
Okay, including that of climate change and the threat of nuclear war. Our inability to meet these challenges also have to do with that. So I actually dub inequality of any form to be structural violence as a violence scholar. And it is the most lethal form of violence. The excess deaths alone that results from this kind of violence exceeds all deaths resulting from suicides, homicides, and collective violence combined year after year. So I cannot stress enough the seriousness of this. And the inequality that we can perceive in society is to an extent the result of an economic arrangement that is a disorder of its own. When making America where you can get rich again, as was touted during the Reagan era, that actually effectively destroyed the ability for the overwhelming majority of the people to achieve that end. And to a greater extreme, Donald Trump has done that by usurping his followers' reasoning and to offer grand claims to make America great again, just as he was destroying it. And so detecting these pathologies and addressing them, and collectively, we can do this by bringing the different disciplines together to solve these problems. The deterioration of national politics was predictable and therefore preventable, and prevention is possible where there is knowledge and understanding. So sharing a unified purpose as we recruit and exchange resources across different disciplines and diverse sectors is one of the powerful methods of public health. And I would say that they apply here also.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Professor Rubenstein, what are your proposals, please?
Yes, let me talk quickly about some short-term and long-term proposals. I think our aim, I think probably all the panelists are in agreement on this, is to take seriously, to identify and to do something about the basic human needs of our people, whether they're called adversaries or not, whether we agree with them about everything or not. On a short-term basis, I'm reminded, I want to tell a quick story about one of my students who was a doctoral student who was also a nun, who with a Catholic laywoman, she was, the two women, decided for their dissertation to operate clinics, operate a workshop on pro-choice, pro-life, on abortion, the abortion controversy, and to do it in two cities where there had been abortion doctors killed, Buffalo, New York, and Pensacola, Florida. And they understood from the beginning that in dealing with the conflicts of value, conflicts of social value or conflicts of religious value, that their job wasn't to convert one side to give up its ideas and become the other side. Their job at that point was to humanize each side to the other to the extent that they would basically go on disagreeing, but stop killing each other. Right. And it was a very successful experiment and dissertation. In fact, in Buffalo, the workshop ended with people on both sides, again, not agreeing about abortion at all, but agreeing to work together to try to improve the city's adoption system. Since they could all agree that if children needed adoption and parents wanted to adopt them, there should be a better way of doing it than then existed. So that the short-term ideas is really what Justin Frank said about listening being the new talking. The short-term idea is to have discussions across these lines, which have become so hard and fast, even in families, to have discussions in which we're able to understand what the other person's motives are, in the same way that the pro-choice people in these discussions realized that the anti-abortion people weren't just robots doing what the priest told them, that some of them actually cared about life. And the pro-life people realized that the pro-choice people were not just, loose people using abortion as an easy form of birth control. That they actually women don't like having abortions, right? So that's short term. Long term, I have to say that I think part of what needs to be done is to help ourselves overcome the taboos that prevent us from identifying features of our system, a system which in some ways has become sacred, or which goes to great pains to sanctify itself. To be able to identify features of the system that are not working, that have broken down and are causing suffering among our people. And then to talk freely and honestly about ways of fixing the system or about ways of replacing elements of the system that aren't working. We have to be able to say the word capitalism, for example, without immediately being accused of being some kind of communist for even mentioning the C word. And talk honestly about what's working in that system, what's not working. So, while I think very highly of Joe Biden's infrastructure proposals, which are a good deal more than simple infrastructure proposals, I'm concerned that if those proposals don't allow people to reconsider things like how property should be owned, to reconsider and most importantly, to reconsider how people can be allowed to participate in decision-making about economic and other issues that affect them greatly, then we're going to be in trouble. I think Justin Frank was talking about Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was a very authoritative figure, but as I think Dr. Lee said, or several people have said, not authoritarian, but authoritative. What made him authoritative but not authoritarian was that he wasn't just exercising power from the top down. He was confronted by enormous power coming from the bottom up through trade unions, through immigrant associations, through all kinds of people's organizations, have probably maybe never been as active as they were in the 30s and also in the 40s. I think if Democrats can't look forward to empowering people in that way, in this kind of dangerous way, but letting people actually participate actively and make some of their own decisions, then this either or between authority or freedom is going to come to haunt us. It doesn't have to be an either or. If the authority is ourselves operating collectively, then the problem is largely solved. That's how Roosevelt solved it, or that's how
you have about a minute, Dr. Rubenstein.
Well, I'm finished, really. I mean, that's what I wanted to say. And I'm hopeful about it. I mean, I think it's a terrifically hopeful time for us now. But I'm hopeful with this reservation that we have to be open, it seems to me, to considering the possibilities of systemic change, and not just papering over these difficulties and going back to business as usual.
Thank you, Dr. Rubenstein. Professor Simmons, please continue.
Yeah, I'm going to show you some pictures again. But what I'm going to say is that if in order, this is a bit ironic, but I think in order to heal the country, Democrats are going to have to win some elections. And I hate to sound partisan in that. I know I'm among partisans, but what I mean by that is that you've got to do intra-party healing. That is the language I really liked hearing from my fellow panelists is wounds, pain, mourning. You know, we've heard this many different times. And I think that there is a lot of that, and you're going to have to address it. But in order to deal with that, you're going to have to deal with a problem, which is a lot of the people who are wounded in pain and who are mourning stuff happen to be white voters, and they aren't voting for Democrats enough. That's part of the challenge. And I think that the challenge we face, therefore, is with a leadership which is much more diverse, more female, and is going to continue to be. And then how does that leadership, which is going to continue to be more comprised of people of color and of women, than maybe even the general population to some extent of leadership, how is that leadership, the diverse leadership, going to address the problem? So here's a chart that this is from 2020. And it's just pretty simple. And I just put it up here. There's both, okay, how do people do among whites and blacks and so on? This, our categories aren't good. But look at the number that's the marginals. 67% of these exit poll voters called themselves white, whatever that is. I mean, white's a weird category. But whatever that is, they call themselves that. And this isn't just 2020. This goes back, so this goes back even to the 90s, because Perot took a lot of the vote that would have been otherwise in this category. So you've got this group of people, and they're disenchanted in some way, they're disenfranchised in their own mind, right? And they're wounded. So what do you do with these folks? How do you bring some of them back? And how do you, let me just say, how does the leadership, how do we as women and people of color, let me just say that as leaders who are more diverse and who are more female in general, how do we start to win some of those folks back over? Because I'm going to suggest that that's important, because there's an issue of the swing voter that we have to address. Let me just go back to my picture here. So again, you might be able to reach out to the Charles Koch loving folks. I mean, there's some of that out there that you can do. You can get some libertarians over to your side. That's fine. You'll be able to bring some of these Trump voters back. Okay. But in the short run, you're going to have to unify the Democratic Party. And in order to do that, you're going to have to mourn and accept that the old white working class coalition of the New Deal is gone. We've lost. It's not there anymore. Okay. Now, something new can be created, but it's going to have to be, the leaders are going to have to look different. There's going to be a difference in leadership. It's going to be the squad. It's going to be Stacey Abrams. It's going to be people who have the energy and momentum, and they're going to be younger, right? They're going to be young people of color, and they're going to lead. But how are they going to lead? They're going to have to lead, as Bernie Sanders recognized. They're going to have to lead on some of these issues where you bring up the things about capitalism you don't like. And the word we talk in our own university, even at the highest levels, we're talking about decolonization, which is pretty radical stuff if you think about it. If you go back to the 1950s about decolonization, that would have been seen as pretty radical stuff. We don't talk about decommodification. We almost never talk about it. What is that? What would decommodification mean? Well, one thing it would mean is you don't, even my daughter said this the other day, wait, you have to make money to survive in this society? I'm like, oh yeah. You got to make money to survive in this society. It's like, but how do you do all the other stuff? It's like, well, you either starve or not. I mean, that's the way you're free to live, to sleep under a bridge unless you're arrested, right? So the point is that you've got to deal with decommodification so that people have the opportunity to do other stuff. I think that's one of the challenges. We don't talk enough about it. It would mean having things like education, having some place to live, having some health care. And then those wounds, and it'll demonstrate to people that they can make it, they can get ahead a little bit. So I think you're gonna have to unify the Democrats. It's gonna have to be led more by Stacey Abrams than Bernie Sanders, okay? That's how it's gonna look, but it's gonna have to address the issues that Bernie Sanders addresses. This is a chart. I don't know if I have time to get into this, but the main thing is this. The party leadership.
3 minutes. You have 3 minutes.
Perfect. I can do it in that. So the party leadership, you all, right? You're probably, you're more diverse than you might have once been. There's more women who are in leadership than what might have been true before. But the party leadership is more attracted to what I'll call a dignity message. It's a dignity, meaning the hierarchy of human value needs to be eliminated, right? We need to get rid of that. We need to recognize one another in our value. So see, I've got this bold line. The dignity message tends to produce dignity legislation. But remember, message and legislation don't have to go together. You can separate them. You can get the class legislation without ever talking about it. Medicare in 64 didn't appear in the record very much. Johnson didn't run on it because he knew he was going to win. So they never talked about it in 64, but they won it anyway. You get the if you don't message it. So you can elect leaders who have a dignity message, and you're going to get class legislation, which is, I think, sort of what we see Biden doing. There's going to be a lot of interesting class legislation coming along, not a whole lot of class messaging. Now, the challenge is that's the short run, which we was talking about. Over the longer run, you're going to have to win over those swing voters. And remember, I said, a lot of those people are white, and a lot of them are non-college educated whites. So they will be more likely to be drawn to a class message, which might not be as appealing to you in the short run. But eventually, we're going to have to learn how to message this better, and that'll lead to class legislation more directly. And there's a model for this for those of you who are working with people who are very much animated by the current challenge we face, George Floyd and other challenges. W.E.B. Du Bois. If I have to say one leader to go back and read, Black Reconstruction in America. Why? Because he's very clearly, he was in the opposite situation when you could message class, but you couldn't message dignity, right? That was his situation. We're reversed. But what he did do is he always was anchored into think about the Black working class versus the white working class, how they're set up against one another, how it's a divide and conquer strategy introduced after 1876, after Reconstruction was ended. And that's when we get Jim Crow, and that's when the whites divide from the blacks. But he was always thinking about this class messaging. And he knew, because in the 30s when he was writing this, that was the stuff that was going to win. Now it's the opposite. Now the dignity message is going to win. It's going to be Black Lives Matter. It's going to be something in that general area. That's going to have to be the narrative in the story. But you can still get class legislation along with that. So as leaders, keep in mind, you can still legislate along class dimensions. And I'm not saying socialism. I'm just saying pay attention to the normal people. But you can do it through a dignity message. But over the long run, when you go to the special districts, you go around the country, you go to Missouri, you're going to have to start thinking about how do you do a class message too, so that those swing voters will start to come over, because we've got a structural problem, especially in the Senate. And you're never going to win over the Senate in these rural areas if you don't address this sense of mourning and loss that many of those white voters have in an America that's just going to be different, and it will be different, and the world is going to be different. So that's my basic story here about what to do. You got to win elections as Democrats. And the way you're going to have to do it is by accepting the way in which the world has changed, and therefore how the story has changed. But it doesn't mean you have to give up on some of these other policy objectives.
Thank you, Professor Simmons. It's time for our second Q&A with the audience. And Abby, I hope you've been monitoring it and you have some questions. Would you please, let's get going on the questions. Over to you, Abby.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. In looking at the questions and listening to the discussion, it seems to me that there are two categories that we start out with. They're certainly not mutually exclusive, and ultimately, in many ways, they merge, and there are common themes. So if the questioners will forgive me, rather than reading discrete questions, I'm going to paraphrase and try to involve all of the panelists as quickly as possible in the discussion. There are those people who are asking on an individual basis, given the diagnoses of Trump supporters, the pathology, the cult, whatever, how do individuals approach other individuals, whether they be family members or friends or whatever, and establish a dialogue with them? And some of the questions get broader than that and talk about how do you approach people, groups like moderate Republicans or evangelicals. And so there, things start to merge. The second clear category of questions are the societal structural questions. What do we need to do to move forward as a society to address the issues? So taking that approach, I wonder if we could, and by the way, what runs through the two, obviously, is the whole issue of pathology, neurosis, how it affects individuals in our society, and then how it affects the society as a whole. So that's really the bridge that bridges both categories. So with that as the starting point, I wonder if perhaps Dr. Frank, you could start off with a discussion of how on that very individual basis, people can overcome the polarization and mental fixations of people that they're intimately involved with as friends or family or whatever, to have a dialogue with them without immediately creating such an offset that it's no longer possible to talk.
Well, it's hard. I think that the first thing is to know that it's hard. The second thing is to see what you have in common with the other person, and that you may have more in common with them than you realize. One of the things in families is love. Nobody's mentioned love yet today. I mean, love is important. And you can love a person who you don't agree with their beliefs, so you can even compartmentalize. One way to do it, like I have a couple of friends who voted for Trump. It drives me crazy. They're good friends. And I just can't talk about it. They even read my book, all my books. They think, and fellow colleagues. It's just very weird for me. But they do it, they say, because they like his policies, but that's bullshit. I think they like the tax cuts. So the way to do it is, I think, to listen and not be superior. I felt just superior now talking about my friend. But it's really that you care about them and that you connect. And then you don't, because the other problem of talking with people is there are certain people who are almost impossible to talk with because they actually only listen to Fox News. What do you do with those people? They really know a lot. They're smart, but they just know the wrong things. They know things that aren't true, but they know a lot. So how are you going to talk to them about the fact that Biden won the election and there wasn't cheating? Those are very hard things to talk about. And, the danger is of talking from what seems to be a superior position. And I was always trained and worked at it, although it isn't really hard for me, is to be dumber than my patients. And so I'm learning from them. And I think that's the same with the family members. I want to know why they like Trump, what they're interested in is, what do they think? Not like they shouldn't like him either. What do they like about what's going on? But to call the people who invaded the insurrection of January 6th, to call that invasion by Antifa is just ridiculous. Anyway, listening, respecting. It's really hard because some people are angry and they get under your skin. I have one friend who's a gun nut. He used to get under my skin and I would just start yelling at him and I couldn't stop.
Yeah, I think there's an implication there in what Dr. Frank says, that an important feature of this is sort of what not to say when you're having a dialogue with. So I'm trying to have a dialogue with somebody, like somebody says the election was stolen. And you say, how can you say that? How can you say the election was stolen? Elections don't get stolen. Oh, they don't? I'm from Chicago. Come on.
Yeah.
Right?
Mayor Daley was the pro.
All right. Or people will say, well, can't the officials say, all the officials say that they were honest. And the mail-in vote and so forth is honest. Oh, you mean politicians don't lie? Officials don't lie? So rather than go to the immediate, to go to the argument that you should trust the officials, or that elections are always pure, and rather than push aside the fact that Biden's margin in victory in 3 crucial states was less than 3%, that it wouldn't have taken a whole lot of fraud, to change the result of the election. You want to eventually, I think, come to the point where you're dealing with people, helping people to realize that they had a lot of chances to produce evidence of fraud and didn't. But that's not where it starts. I think where it starts is we can agree on the fact that that many elections have not been honest, and we can maybe agree on the fact that we need a better election system. That we really do need it. We can't just trust the fact that the elections are always going to be honest. A friend of mine who is in every other way a raving liberal is now going around saying we should have identity cards, and we should have a nice holiday that we vote on. And you go to the polls, you show your identity card, you vote. End of discussion. However you come out on this kind of question, it seems to me that the key to a dialogue. I mean, I have a brother-in-law who voted for Trump too, and we agree on basically nothing when it comes to politics. So we don't talk politics, but then after a while we do, because you can't not. I mean, because it creeps back into the conversation, and by the time we begin to talk politics, we've sort of defined an area in which we know we're not going to be at each other's throats. At least we can talk and listen and talk like human beings. So I think that the art of dialogue is something that, maybe Dr. Lee and Dr. Frank are professionals at it, and Solon and I try to be professionals at it, but it's really something we all have a lot to learn how to do. And part of the answer is clearly not going at not kind of scratching that itch and going at that difference and hoping to convert the other side to your point of view, because that ain't going to happen. I just want to say one other thing, that often this conflict is often compared with a religious conflict, and you might even say in some ways it is. If you believe that there's such a thing as a civil religion, it is a kind of religious conflict. And religious conflicts are hard to resolve, but they're not impossible to resolve. But what you need is patience, find a way to talk to each other, patience, and trying to find out, to go back to the original conversation, what the sources of pain are so that something can be done to alleviate them.
Dr. Lee, you focused a great deal on the societal structural issues that have driven this situation. So could you comment on how you think things are moving now? Are they headed in the right direction? What more needs to be done? How would we go about it? What are some of your ideas in that area?
Yes, I think I will combine the two questions together because I think they're related. We often think about the relational problems we have as our personal problems, but as we can see, it's very widespread. I would say it's more a structural one in that, going back to Dr. Frank's formulation of this as a cult, well, differently from a cult, our family members, friends, and neighbors are not physically separated from us, and they are not insulated from news sources that would give them valid information, but they are psychologically conditioned to insulate themselves and to separate themselves psychologically. And so I think it's very important to think of it as a systemic issue. I agree with not confronting them and not trying to persuade them, because that will cause doubling down. And if they're truly challenged, they could even grow violent, as we've seen. So it is a societal problem, but individually giving them space, societally giving them a space where they will be accepted and be dignified and allowed to belong in society, that will go a long way. And so that then goes to the structural problem. The structural problem that we have right now is that we, until recently, had been simply normalizing a severely impaired president who was worsening a lot of the structures, either through rhetoric or through policy. And so we got rid of him as president, but we have not gotten rid of his influence. He still has considerable hand pressure on the Republican Party, and he's still the #1 most popular president after causing hundreds and thousands of excess COVID-19 deaths and almost overthrowing the US government by inciting a violent insurrection. So there has to be some kind of response, and prosecution, conviction, not allowing him to hold office, prohibiting him from any kind of social media expansion. These kinds of things will take care of the immediate problem and the growing cult and enduring cult that he has. Secondly, I would say regulating and reducing the cultic programming that is vastly present. Disinformation should not be allowed to be called news. They should not be allowed to be called facts. And the public needs to have access to information just as much as it has to have access to expertise and intellectuals and professionals, as I was mentioning earlier. And then thirdly, to fix the socioeconomic conditions that gave rise to this in the first place. And how is the current administration doing? It has surprised me in a number of ways, in that it has very actively tried to meet the needs. But we absolutely need urgent and immediate fixing of a lot of these problems, and some of the solutions might come from, as I said, allowing experts to be able to share their knowledge, because we do have the solutions very clearly researched in many areas, in many fields. So allowing that conversation to happen and allowing the public access to these kinds of conversations are all important. We actually had a presidency where mental health experts were silenced from speaking about the mental impairments of the president. This kind of situation should not occur again.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. It's time to wrap up this Q&A and move into part 3. And this is where I'm going to turn this all over to an open roundtable panelist discussion among the 4 of you. And I'm going to invite you to engage with each other. And I'm going to, as moderator, to try to stand back. And then I'll let you know when it's time to wrap up. So who wants to begin?
I always like to start. You start though.
I wanted to ask about this Goldwater Rule thing. Why is that we can't use psychiatry or psychology to speak about political figures? Is that something that's from another era that just doesn't work anymore? I mean, it seems that this is a helpful thing to do, is to be able to speak about that kind of an issue. Just kind of curious.
1964, when Goldwater ran against Johnson, there was a brochure questionnaire to psychiatrists saying, do you think Goldwater is stable enough to have his finger on the nuclear button? And a lot of the people said no. And then he lost the election, which had nothing to do with that, because Johnson was inheriting Kennedy's popularity, plus even more popular. But Goldwater sued the American Psychiatric Association and won.
Justin,
Yeah.
He sued Fact magazine.
Well, I thought he sued the APA too.
The American, no, the APA was embarrassed, but the American Medical Association, which was one of the biggest lobbies and was highly Republican, pressured the APA into instituting the Goldwater Rule. Right. But the original Goldwater Rule prohibits only diagnosis. With the Trump presidency, the APA has prohibited any comment of any kind on a public figure, right. Unless you've done an examination and gotten consent from them, which is actually a ridiculous condition, right. Because when someone is posing a danger to the public, we actually have an obligation to protect the public. So anyhow, I'll just...
I actually agree with all of that. In fact, but the Goldwater Rule, I always felt, because I'm more cynical about finances, I really think the APA liked it because they were afraid of being sued. Yeah. And yes, the fear of lawsuits, and that it's not, it has nothing to do with ethics, or very little.
Well, it had to do with federal funding. Actually, the CEO of the APA himself said it was for funding reasons that they changed the rule into a gag order. In fact, it's different from what it was in the past. Yes. So 2 months after Donald Trump's inauguration,
when I wrote the Bush on the couch, yeah, but when I wrote Bush on the Couch, I called the president of the APA, who's a friend of mine. We trained together in Boston. And I said, I want to warn you that I'm coming out with this book, and that it's never been done to analyze a sitting president, but it's applied psychoanalysis. It was 2 years of research. And he said to me, thank you for telling me. We were friends, we are friends. But he said that I was skating on thin ice as far as the Goldwater Rule. And I said, well, that's why I'm about to resign from the APA, because I want to be able to say what I think. And I wish people had written these kinds of books in 1935 in Munich.
Isn't it funny how the medical profession so overstates their influence and objectivity?
Yes.
That they think if a psychiatrist says this president is nuts, they think people around the country aren't going to say, well, that's the psychiatrist's view. What I mean, what do they think that there's some kind of medical body has found Trump or anybody else to be crazy, or do they think this is a psychiatrist? I'm a lawyer and I think he breaks the law. I teach one of the courses I teach is conflict in literature, and at the beginning of near the beginning of the Trump era, I said I thought Trump was a fool in the Shakespearean sense. And we talked to the students about what being a fool really meant, and what foolishness meant. Well, I mean, I'm going to get sued that I'm not practicing my profession carefully enough or something because I called him a
fool. And King Lear spoke the truth.
Well, that's true. So, and Trump, now and then Trump did too. But
yes. Well, I actually wanted to say something about this thing that I really feel is about loss. I think there's a loss of a fantasy. And there's a fantasy that I just can personally say, I actually believed in the Constitution. And I realized after January 6th that the Constitution's a piece of paper and it's an idea. And they can't even support it. And I think that what Trump visited upon us is that there are a lot of lost ideals, and I'm as much as I get angry, I'd rather get angry at presidents, but I've never doubted their patriotism in a way, even Reagan. But I do think that this is a terrible situation. There's a loss of not our soul, it's actually a loss of belief. What I used to think was a fact, I realize is a belief. I mean, it's sort of like Santa Claus or something, It used to be a fact when you're 4, but it's a belief after a little while. This is a belief, the Constitution. To me, I don't know what you guys think, but it really bothers me terribly.
For me, it's a matter of having the mental capacity to take on these issues, and we haven't had that. That's why, I started speaking up when the APA issued a gag order, because for me, that was ceding the profession's authority to power. And that's the first sign of authoritarianism, where, as Professor Rubenstein said, it's not authoritative, it's not true authority, but it's ceding authority to power. And I think because of the demands of this pathology, that we have ceded not only the mental health profession's authority, but also legal authority and constitutional authority.
But people are afraid. It's amazing to me that people are afraid of Trump, that so many people, I assume they're afraid of being primaried, but I don't understand it. When I wrote the Trump book, a good friend of mine who's a lawyer retired lawyer, who's really smart and very liberal, he said, "Thank you for being cannon fodder for the rest of us." I just didn't get it.
Wow.
Well, you and I know he is disordered and handicapped,
yes.
But most people see his grandiose projections as power and force,
as
even if illegitimate and fearful.
You know, I'm also curious about the pathologies that might not be so dissimilar on the left. That is how we are also damaged through this, and you know, and that Justin's comment about the mourning the loss of the Constitution, which people I don't think ever figured could be dislodged, and how are we becoming wounded, you know, through all of this, and are we overreacting through all of this, and is that part of what makes it so hard to have conversations?
I think one of the damaging things for me is depression about where this country is. But I think that the damaging thing that Trump has done is really, he's made an attack on thinking.
That's true too.
Thinking is dangerous, and that he has attacked it in a very violent way all the time. So there's no sensibilities for an independent thought, or for, you know, being able to say what you think and what you feel. My puppy has woken up from his Prozac and apologize. But there's a real problem on the left, I think, that part of it is Trump actually said, "Don't believe what you see. It's not real." And he would say that over and over again. And I became preoccupied with him. And I read almost all of his tweets over writing the book. And I think it has affected my brain. The second thing is I gained about 50 pounds writing the book. So that's not good. I just had to eat all the time because I couldn't stand it. But the other thing about Trump is that, and it's something that Nietzsche talked about, is that when you oppose Trump, some people become like Trump in order to oppose him. So then we become angry, destructive people. In fact, once I made a comment about something cool that Trump did. I don't remember what it was now. And people would criticize me. How can you say that? It's the same thing I talked about with my kids, the Red Sox and the Orioles. You know, how can you possibly say that somebody so evil could say something interesting? I mean,
I treat individuals a lot like Trump, because I treat violent offenders, and they usually come to me after having done something pretty horrendous. And I think what the most common response upon encountering such an individual is loss of faith in humanity. And so I think the trauma that the left, or those who are not swept up in the pathology, is probably far greater than we are able to recognize and even willing to recognize. And so there will be a lot of healing that our nation needs to do from the trauma, from the unmitigated pathology that was allowed to continue in the most powerful office.
But I mean, I agree with that. I think that the issue is that for some reason, people are afraid to set limits. One of the things that Bandy and I both learned, even though we trained in different places and have different backgrounds, is that one of the ways you deal with behavioral problems is the first thing you have to do, especially with adolescents, is set limits. You have to stop it. And one of the things that makes them calmer in some ways too often. One of the things that struck me as I was afraid to go to Germany for all these years, being a German Jew, but I was always uncomfortable. And when I went there, it was amazing because on every little step, there's memories of Holocaust things and everything. It was very special. And I was realizing that there's nothing about that in terms of the people who were lynched, the people who were attacked in this country in the Civil War, and that we don't even talk about the fact that perspective is also for polarization. If the South is going to call the Civil War, which we call the Civil War, the war of northern aggression, which they do in all their textbooks, what does that mean to us? And why couldn't the people in charge of this country in the 1870s ban the Confederate flag like they banned the swastika in Germany?
Well, that puts me in mind of the fact that one of the friends of our school is a guy named Joe Montville, who was a former State Department official and then became a conflict resolver. And Joe is one of his projects for several years has been healing the wounds of the Civil War.
Yeah,
there's the idea that somehow that conflict is settled, and that it's just gone into the past, and we can all forget about it. It wasn't a trauma on both sides of major proportions.
Sure.
Is just wrong.
There's a great book, if you like the novel, David Bradley. Did you ever read his novel, The Cheneyville Incident from 1981?
No. If you recommend it, I will.
It's wonderful. Wonderful. And it's very much about this guy a black man going into his past, and he's married to a white psychiatrist in Boston. But it's really amazing story.
We have about 1 minute. If anybody among the panel would like to make a closing statement before we have to stop.
I'm going to say one thing because I love talking. Since I'm a Kleinian, Kleinians talk all the time. Freudians never talk. But the Kleinians would say that I want to mention James Baldwin because he's so important to all of this. And the title of his last book, which I have not read yet, but I love the title. It's called The Evidence of Things Not Seen. And I think we're talking about that a lot here, and that we know things and we feel things and we need to see them. The question is now, what do we do after January 6th? Because we saw it. It was the evidence of things seen.
True. Well, my closing comment is that I have not been on many panels where I thought it was okay, but once the program ended, it was fine, except that I wanted to stay with the panel and have coffee or something else. And that's how I feel about this group. I enjoyed this very much.
This has been great.
I feel that way too. Thank you.
Yeah, I do too. And I love the thing about class. I hadn't thought about Bernie Sanders that way, which was very helpful and interesting. That there's a real difference between Bernie and Stacey in terms of their fundamental orientation. And I agree with you both about both of the conflict resolution people about criticizing capitalism. People are just afraid to do it. Yeah. And I have a friend who you might like to meet. I should put you in touch with him, named Jeremy Moeller, who is a really smart guy. And all he does is write about capitalism. And he's really straight 800 on the college boards. He's great.
Well, thank you all. And when we get back to in-person times, maybe we can arrange a coffee among us all. I want to thank you all on behalf of all of us. And particularly, thank you for helping us analyze, understand, and hopefully enable us to deal more effectively with our adversaries so that we can and will actually want to reach out for their hands, not their throats.
Yeah.
And conclusion, as Democrats and activists, I think we hear that our challenge is to listen to our adversaries and to work to enact policies that recognize and relieve the socioeconomic needs. I'm going to say clearly especially in rural jurisdictions, those needs that wound and generate extreme alienation among them. We also need to identify shared values and devise some practical, shared, values-based policies to try to meet the unsatisfied cultural and political needs of our adversaries. It's not an exaggeration to assert that we must meet this challenge to preserve our peace, our democracy, and our country. This completes our forum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.